Hello, everybody. This is Ed Brenniger, and welcome to a First Conversation. First Conversations are a collection of the interviews that I did during the first year of the Eddy Network podcast with people who I had never met before, but who had been introduced to me or connected to me. And this is our first time talking, and therefore we call it First Conversations. You can find a playlist of these First Conversations at my YouTube channel. Look for Ed Brenniger there. My guest today is Ludvig Kirkeby, an anthropology student, undergraduate student in Copenhagen, Denmark. His father, Ola, was also a guest on the podcast last year. But I enjoyed talking with Ludvig and seeing what a European Gen Zer mindset is and what he's thinking about for his life and his understanding of the world. I have had the opportunity to talk with several Gen Zers from Europe, and I appreciate their perspective, and I think we should listen to them because they have something to say to us. So I'm grateful for Ludvig's coming on the show, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Conversations. Thank you, and we'll see you next time here on the Eddy Network podcast. Bye-bye. Hello, everyone. This is Ed Brenniger, and welcome to the Eddy Network podcast. My guest today is Ludvig Kirkeby. How's that pronunciation?
That's a good pronunciation.
For an American, yeah.
Yeah, no, of course.
I have trouble with the Danish pronunciation, but because I'm not Danish, so that's why. Ludvig, it's great to have you here. Just so that you all know, Ludvig is the son of one of my other guests, Ola Kirkeby, who is a Danish philosopher, and he was on a few weeks ago. So this is the first time a second person from a family has been on the podcast, and I think this is a banner day. And I'm glad you're here. And tell us a little bit about yourself, Ludvig, and things that you're interested in, and just so we can get to know you a little bit.
Yeah. Thank you so much first and foremost, thank you so much for the opportunity to come on the podcast, Ed. I really appreciate it. My name is, as stated, Ludvig Kirkeby. I am 20 years old, and I live in central Copenhagen. Currently, I am on a leap year, but I am about to start studying anthropology in the Copenhagen University. That is its name, Københavns Universitet, as said in Danish. And well, I can't wait to study it. I think it's a amazing field that I think some in my generation, I am Gen Z, I think some in my generation will think is a bit old, a bit of an old subject to study, but I think it's as relevant as ever, due to the whole point of it being looking into different cultures and how people are affected by their culture and act based on it. And well, yeah.
Was there some experience or someone you heard speak or something you read that was the real trigger to this interest?
Well, ironically enough, my dad was actually the first who introduced me.
Not surprised.
Who introduced me to anthropology. I was originally looking down a much more technical road of IT, but due to a factor called mathematics, which I have a personal hate of, I ended up looking more towards different fields, let's say. So the first person I asked was my dad, and he said, maybe you should check out anthropology. And I did, and I read about it, and now I can't be more than happy to get a chance to study it. I have been reading a book recently called 100 Years of Loneliness by how's the name pronounced? It's a Mexican author. I forget his name, sadly, but it's a great book. It is actually a fantasy book, but it illustrates fictional book, sorry, but it illustrates the Latin American culture very, very well. And it has kind of been my first introduction to and kind of anthropology inspired text, due to just how representative it is of the culture. And I would say it has been a very, very interesting one. I love just reading the nitty gritty of how people act based on the way they're brought up and their uh, and yeah, and their culture, like the way they talk, the way they go about their day, the different things they do that are that are in such contrast to the lives that we live, like that I, for example, live as a boy in a big city. When I, for example, look at this book, 100 Years of Loneliness, which is about a Latin American family in a small village far away on an island, the village called Macondo. But yeah, like just the contrast and also the, yeah, what can you say, like the different ideologies that are carried by the people due to their upbringing, different to mine. Like, for example, many of my ideologies are carried by Greek philosophers, also thanks to my dad. But I have read a lot of Greek philosophers, and a lot of my ideologies are from there. Whereas these peoples in this book, for example, have a whole nother ideology, one much more based on survivalism, for example, or uh, a more nature respecting belief or ideology, which is also actually a reason why I decided to study anthropology. This whole perspective of nature and what you would call anthropocentrism, which is the idea that humanity is above nature. Um, and I find it very, very interesting how different cultures view this belief differently. How we, in the bigger cities, if I would say it as such, see anthropocentrism as a normalized thing, in the way that I mean that forests, for example, are obstructions. They need to be brought down to incite more gain, and some more cities can be built, for example. Whereas someone like this family in Macondo would believe that the forests are holy and have a whole nother purpose, that you shouldn't just tear them down, and that they have and that they benefit the city just by being there. Um, yeah, yeah, that is
Yeah,
fun.
that's fascinating, and I commend you for being as clear in demonstrating what these concepts are, because I think you're onto something significant, and it's I think it's a product of the way um, modern thought, modern science, modern uh, research, all those things has been conducted over the last 200 or 300 years, which was highly reductive and highly fragmented. And I think when what you're kind of characterizing is being able to see things as a whole,
Yeah,
and understand where everything fits. How do we fit into the whole of nature, or whole of all that has been created, or all that is? I think being able to ask that question is a really important one.
exactly, exactly. And that question as a whole is a personal one to me, actually, in some ways, because I find it so important that we focus on how we treat nature. um, and this is also a belief that is very common amongst my generation, I think, and it's something that I personally fight for, because I believe that the most pressing issue, at least globally, of our generation is the climate one. And getting a proper understanding of our position, I feel like that's a very important question, both for my generation, but also for myself, due to nature being the most pressing issue of our current world, I would mean, since we're just so far behind. And there are many, many reasons for this. You can blame capitalism if you want, you can blame the Industrial Revolution or whatever. But the matter of fact is that you won't be able to change anything unless you educate yourself and educate the people. And a way to do that is through anthropology. And through anthropology, we can get a better understanding of why we are so anthrocentric, and then we might be able to, throughout time, convert ourselves to be eco-centric, where we focus on our position in nature and how we can live with nature. Something that I feel you could look at already now is actually Japan and how they work with nature in their architecture, for example. And that has also been a cultural and traditional thing, but it's something that I admire very, very much because I feel that their way to build around nature and include it without destroying it, at least attempting to, is so beautiful and often also provides more beautiful architecture than at least I myself see, for example, here in Copenhagen. But again, that's also preference. But but in many ways, I feel like building with nature is much, much prettier than building without it. So
I would agree with you, and I think the being able to characterize what nature actually is, in its broad, comprehensive sense, I think is part of the challenge that not just anthropologists but philosophers and people have. And this is, this is something I've been seeing for a long time, and and how we, it's not just how we think about it, but it's also what we do as a result of how we think is a major part of the challenge. So characterize for me the Gen Z mindset about the world we're living in and the future that they see before them, before you.
Yeah. Well, before I characterize, I have to say that it is, of course, a bit of a subjective characterization. I don't think I would be able to speak for the entirety of Gen Z,
Yeah,
but yeah, of course. But the way I see it, also with the people I talk with that are in my generation, then it is kind of split up into two. But both share a ground, I'd say one view that they both share would probably be a rather anti-capitalism one. I feel like my generation are very, very focused on how capitalism is one of the main factors to climate change and is something that we will need to combat if we want to combat climate change. When I say that there are two different groups, I probably mean, well, I mean the pessimistic one and the hopeful one. I feel like I lie a bit in between, but that is because personally I see a lot of hope for the future. I see a lot of hope for the world. I feel like my generation and the one after us, as well as the millennials, partly, will be able to set in motion events that will positively change the way we see capitalism. Already now, we can see massive strikes across the entire world where people are fighting for their rights and the way they're being treated by society and capitalism as a whole. And I feel that's a very good stepping stone and a first, well, yeah, step towards the greater change that we need to commit in order to fight climate change. And I think that's something that my generation can agree on. Is probably the the general anti-capitalism stance.
So
And
so are you and your millennial cohort members coming to this conclusion because of what you have been taught in school, or is this a reaction to what you have been taught in school?
that's actually a great question. Um, that's a really good question.
Okay, let me put one more piece to that. What I'm really interested in is how do you come to have your perspective and your opinion about these things? What is it that you all are doing to derive that? And that's what I'm really interested in.
Yeah. I'd probably say, just to also answer your question about the education system. I don't think that, at least my own opinions about capitalism is from the education system. I feel like I wasn't properly educated about the negatives of capitalism, but I feel like I was probably educated about the urgency and yeah, the urgency of climate change. I think that's also something we have a big focus on in Denmark, but it was that led me into speaking with groups and people who then were anti-capitalist because many people who are very, very pro fighting climate change and very in that scene are also anti-capitalist. A lot of my friends have introduced me to this way of thinking, sort of, I'd say. Also, I watch an individual who I know very, very many of my generation loves to watch, who's very, very pro-socialist, but is an American by the name of Hassan Abi. And he is a socialist speaker. And he's an example of someone who kind of goes out and spreads this idea of capitalism being the root to many evils, while also saying that due to capitalism being this root to many evils, we need to combat it in order to save the climate. Um, but yeah, but I mean, I'd have a hard time saying that capitalism is the only factor. Obviously, I'd just say that it's one of the most crucial. But again, that's also a personal opinion. But yeah, yeah,
I guess it helps to be able to define what these terms are. I mean, when you're in conversations with people that are your age, for example, or you're in conversations with people that are multi-generational, it's helpful to define these words, because and I'll just give you an example. You see, and from my generation, we don't see capitalism like you see capitalism. And what we see is capitalism is the freedom of the individual to start their own business and make money and support their families and create institutions for their local communities. So it's a economic system based on freedom. But what I see is what the general kind of term of what people see as capitalism now is really much more of a state-sponsored capitalism. That's capitalism that's run by the state. And they're using the mechanism of the state to make money for large corporations. Over and against those who would have small businesses and that sort of thing. So there's this kind of conflict. I mean, for my generation, we see this inherent conflict in what we call capitalism, and that's part of the problem when we begin to talk about public policy and these sort of things. So that's just to kind of add a dimension to that. And so also we look at socialism in a different light. We don't have it. I mean, we see socialism with the darker side, because we grew up during the time of the Soviet Empire. And so we see that as another factor. So this is why having conversations across generations, I think, are really important, particularly if you're willing to say, I'm willing to have a conversation and be influenced by the person on the other side of the screen or the other side of the table. I think that's where a lot of the progress that we'll find in the future will come from. That's why I like talking. That's why I like talking to Generation Z people. Let me say one more thing about that. So I talked with a group of students in Switzerland about last fall, and and I had a couple of hours, almost 2.5 hours with them, and at the end of the conversation, there were 3 things that emerged from the conversation, and one was they were disappointed with where the world is at. 2, they have fear, concerned about the future, and they were really interested in understanding what it meant to have a purpose for life. And so I'm curious as to how you see those 3 things operating within the circles that you operate in. You move in with your peers.
It's actually very interesting, especially with the cross generational conversations, because something that I see in my generation and something that I also reflect on myself is that there is this hatred for my generation, this hatred that is hard to pin somewhere, and it's kind of a mix of hate and a fear about the future, about our purpose, about what are we supposed to do, because I think a lot of people are feeling helpless when they look at stuff like America and they see these giant corporations with power amounting to literal countries. And when people my generation also know that many of these are the leading cause to our own downfall, stuff like climate change, then it surmounts to this pessimism and hopelessness. And it's very interesting that you talked with these Switzerland students, because they represent many of the things that I myself think. Again, this hopelessness, this idea of what are we supposed to do, what purpose are we supposed to have if there is this immense power that we have no chance of beating. But again, the way I see it, we just have to persevere, because we are a whole generation, we are a whole people. And the more time that goes, the in my opinion, the better the world looks. Like, if you already look now at equality, the way we're treating people now based on 10 years back, both with transgender people, LGBT people, and pronouns as a whole, I see that as an immensely positive movement, and as something that happened in a very short span of time also. And if that can happen, so can we change the world with this hopelessness we feel. Like, I think one thing my generation is good at doing is taking this hopelessness and choosing to combat it, and trying to find ways to improve the world. Which is why when I talk with people in my circles, I can feel just how passionate they are about stuff like socialism, or informing others about how to help with the state of the world, or with the climate, or what to do in your own life, and similar. And I quite frankly find that kind of inspiring. I really do. And I am rather hopeful.
Well, I'm in agreement with you. I like Gen Zers, and I like Gen Xers, and I like millennials. I like all three of those, and I think that they all have been at some point or another been maligned by other generations, and I think it's because the other generations look at them and say, well, they're not like us, and therefore they're going to fail.
Yeah.
And it's a way of deflecting the responsibility of, say, my generation deflects the responsibility onto younger generations as well. They're going to have to deal with this without any real recognition that a lot of what we have done as a generation has created the problems that we're facing. And so I think this is a way of deflecting attention away from the generational responsibility that we have, and I tend to ignore it and rather engage in a positive conversation, because I think ultimately that's our only hope, is that if we can't have a positive conversation where we can decide to take action together on something, then that's when the hopelessness kind of becomes much more prominent.
Yeah, that's true. I find this whole idea of deflecting and also distractions as something that's important to talk about nowadays. But that's because I feel like you see it everywhere. Like, you see these distractions. If you look at, and again, this is because this is stuff that I myself read into. But if you look at people like Ben Shapiro, who is, in my opinion, a horrible man, but if you look at him as an example, you'll see someone that, in large, distracts people by making making conflict that is, in large, irrelevant. And if you look at the people who sponsor him and the like, then it is often giant oil companies. And there's a reason for this. And I'd like to take this back to 2006, when British Petroleum, which is a massive oil company, they founded the carbon footprint, which is a very normalized term today. But I find it so interesting that just something like that was founded by an oil company and was inherently a distraction. And this whole idea of distractions is, for me, the most central thing we have to combat if we want to inform people that action needs to be taken. Because these distractions are attempts from stuff like giant oil companies to keep us away from doing something about them, about regulating them, and about properly, well, what can you say, combating problems at large, such as the climate change.
Yeah, I would agree with you, and I would say that the first question in regards to that is is to ask the question, am I being distracted from what's important?
Yeah.
I think it's a self-reflective thing to begin with, and then you can, what you then you can see is how I hesitate to use the word, but how much the messaging that happens in the culture is essentially propaganda for one side or the other. So how do you look at that as a young man getting ready to go into your university studies and in a significant field of work? How do you view all these messages that we receive, and how do you make choices as to what it is that you believe and what it is that you just kind of discount as is whatever it may be, irrelevant or misinformation or whatever? How do you approach that?
Well, I'd say that's a tough question in the current world we live in, because we are surrounded by yeah, of course. Of course, because we are surrounded by such massive amounts of misinformation. I'd say that I tend to try and take it one day at a time. Likewise, I attempt to avoid social media such as TikTok. But that's because I find that TikTok as a whole is in part very informative for the younger generation, but it's also one of the most effective distractions made yet.
I totally agree.
So I attempt to avoid it as best as possible. And the way I gain and what can you say, quality check my information is through my friends, I'd say. I like sitting down and having long conversations with my friends about stuff like this, stuff like what is happening in the world and what is this and that and etc. And then together with my friends, we kind of inform each other by just a great discussion where we then leave with an understanding that's, better than before. And that is the strength. That's also one of the strengths I find in my generation, is the ability to talk about that and anything.
Yeah.
Like I can sit down with my friends and we can talk about stuff like this. Like it isn't a taboo. There's nothing wrong about it. Likewise, how in my generation, I sit down with my male friends sometimes and talk about feelings and similar, because it's not a taboo. And I find that as a great strength and something I really pride myself on in my generation. But yeah, that was a bit off topic, but
That's great. That's great.
yeah, but yeah, yeah, one day at a time in a massive world of misinformation, and yeah, just it's important to take everything with a grain of salt, even if there are many people in my generation who don't, sadly. But what can you do?
So let's talk about your dad for a few minutes.
Yeah.
I have a great deal of respect for your father, and he's obviously a great philosopher, and deserves the recognition that he's been given. But you grew up in his house, and obviously he's impacted you, and he's so what is it that you want to tell us about him that I don't, and this is not Entertainment Tonight or anything like that. It's really more about the influence that he's had upon you. How do you describe that?
I'd say that my dad has been a very influential figure in my academic life, for example, mainly because of the fact that when I ask him about something I should read or similar, the first thing he'll always suggest me is some kind of book about a philosopher or similar. But likewise, he'll still be very good at what can you say, catering to your to your intellectual needs. Because, for example, the book 100 Years of Loneliness was one that he originally recommended me before I read into it and decided to buy it. And I think the influence he's had on me, except for, well, leading me down a great path, is probably how I, in my, what would I say, teenage years, back when I was 14, 15, I began reading into existentialism and being able to sit and have long conversations with my father about existentialism based on his deep, deep philosophical knowledge was very, very special. And I am very thankful for it being an opportunity. And it's something that I feel like uh, not many might have been able to have because it's very special to have a dad that knows that much about philosophy and similar. But it's just it's like having a sparring partner that knows way more in depth about any thought you've had than you could possibly imagine. And it's so
So
special going and being like, yeah,
let me
sorry,
ask you, does he answer your questions with a question?
what?
Does he answer your questions with a question back to you?
Yes, he does. He does. I think I do. I do think that's a very standard dad thing, but yes, he
Yeah,
does.
it is. I did that with my
He
kids.
Yeah, he does. We've had these sessions recently where I'll be asking him about something. For example, a person. Recently, it was about what's he called? John Locke. Recently, I was reading a bit about him, so I asked him about him, and then he said, "You should go and read up on this and this and this if you want to know about him. You can also read about this and this, and then you know a bit about where he came from and why he did what he did." And it's like it's just it's so interesting. It's like it's not just go read the Wikipedia page, go read this book. It's you can read all of this, and then if you read this, you understand where he came from and etc. And it's like yeah, it's very like no matter what you ask him, he'll somehow know.
So he's more like a tutor. He's
In
tutoring.
in 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 some ways, yeah. It's more an activity we do so that I can let's say better understand his deep knowledge and get a
So
bit more yeah.
as a Dane and as the son of a Danish philosopher, does that mean that you become very well acquainted with Soren Kierkegaard? You
With
read.
what?
Have you?
Søren Kierkegaard. Oh yes, yes. If not from my dad, also through the education system. He's of course a great philosopher and one
Yeah.
that has been preached about several times, both in elementary and longer down the line. So, um,
Is he representative of the way Danish culture exists? Kierkegaard's writings, his existentialism, is that a characteristic of Danish culture?
it's actually an interesting question. I'd say that Danish culture has too many facets to say that he is completely
Okay.
representative.
Okay.
But I think that a lot of the way we Danishmen think is represented in his texts. Um, though I don't think though I don't think all his principles of existentialism apply to the Danish people. Also because what can you say? He kind of tried to reach out beyond the country, if you understand me, with his thoughts.
Yes.
But I would say that if you sat down and read Søren Kierkegaard's texts in an effort to understand the Danish people, then you would get an all right understanding, and you would somewhat know where you're coming from if you had to talk about it. So, yeah.
I happen to have sitting here on my desk,
Ah, perfect. Yeah, I
and
see.
because it fits into the work that I'm writing about now. So yeah, he's a, he's a he's an important figure beyond Denmark, and he's an important figure for I think the future of the world. So I celebrate that, and so
Yeah.
you should feel some level of pride of being his countryman.
I I I do. I do take pride in it.
So have you read your father's books?
I have not, but the reason is that I have attempted to read them a few times, but there's just this very weird feeling to reading something your dad has written. It's
My
like
children have not read my books either, so
yeah, exactly. It's like
so
it gets
I think
it's
it's the child of parent thing. Yeah, so
yeah,
it's
it's the thing
very
like it
very
just
definitely.
that's the thing. It gets a bit eerie because the writings are so distant to what you're used to because they're not written specifically to you.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's like I mean, my dad has, of course, amazing things to say, and I've also heard a lot about them through the man himself. But I have specifically not read his books, and neither have my brother actually. So yeah, I do think it is just like a child to father thing. Yeah.
Yeah, they all have copies of. I wrote a book. I wrote this book that came out in 2018. They all have copies. I don't know if they're in a box somewhere hidden in a closet. I don't know where they are, but it's that sort of thing. Well, I've enjoyed talking with you. Let me suggest that we do this again, and then maybe have 2 or 3 of your friends with you, and then we have a group discussion like this. And
Discussion.
I think that would be a lot of fun. I would gain so much from that, just hearing and listening to you all, and I don't, we could take a particular topic or whatever we want to do. But I think that what I'm trying to do with the Eddy Network podcast is simply create conversation on a global scale that has effects upon people in their local communities, and there's nothing better than having that as a shared conversation with a group of people who already know each other. And I'm just kind of intruding into that little circle, with my questions and my little podcast here. So
I have a great amount of respect for what you're trying to do, and I'd really like to see it to its end. And I've really enjoyed talking to you today also. And you know what? I'll ask my friends if they'd be up for a conversation. I have some very interesting friends. I think you'd like to meet them.
I would love it. That would be really sweet. So we'll stay in touch and we'll talk about that. And thank you for joining us today, and we'll link to you somehow. We'll link to your LinkedIn, and that way people want to comment to you directly. That way you can get to know them, and that's the cool thing that we're doing here. So thanks, Ludvig. Appreciate it.
Of course.
And
yeah.
Thank you
so
everyone.
much.
Yeah, thank you everyone for watching the Eddy Network podcast. Please subscribe, hit the like button, and if you have a comment or question, please offer that. And I look forward to seeing you next time here on the Eddy Network podcast. See you, Ludvig. Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah. See you. Bye.